The woman grabbed the jar right out of Margaret's hands. Not borrowed. Not asked. Grabbed. You actually think people are going to pay for this? Diane Holloway held the mason jar up to the farmer's market light like she was inspecting evidence at a crime scene. The amber preserves caught the sun. Gorgeous, warm, glowing. She didn't see any of that. Peach jam made from damaged fruit from the discount bin? She laughed, loud enough that 3 other vendors turned to look. Margaret, honey, go home. Nobody's buying charity garbage from a woman who can't even afford real peaches. She set the jar down. Hard. It didn't break, but the sound cracked through the morning air like a slap. Margaret didn't say a word. She didn't have to. Not yet. Oh, if you want to know what happened next, subscribe, hit that bell, and drop your city in the comments below. I want to see exactly how far this story travels. And trust me, you don't want to miss what's coming. The peaches were the ugliest things Margaret Calloway had ever bought on purpose. She stood in the back corner of Hendrick's Produce, that cramped, slightly too warm market on the edge of Clover Falls, Tennessee. And she stared at the cardboard flat sitting on the floor like somebody had given up on it. 22 peaches, give or take, bruised, soft in places they weren't supposed to be soft. A few had split at the seam, leaking just enough juice to make the whole flat smell almost painfully sweet. The hand-lettered sign above them said, "Damaged, as is, $3 for the flat." $3. She had 11 in her purse. She needed gas. She needed a gallon of milk. She needed, if she was being completely honest with herself, about 40 things she couldn't afford that week. She bought the peaches. "You sure about those, hun?" The kid behind the register, couldn't have been more than 19, looked at the flat the way you look at something you're about to throw away. "We got good ones up front. The Red Havens just came in." "I'm sure," Margaret said. She counted out 3 ones, smoothed them flat on the counter because she had the habit of making things neat even when everything else wasn't. "These are exactly what I need." She carried them to her car, a 2009 Civic with a dent in the passenger door that she'd stopped noticing 2 years ago. She set the flat on the back seat carefully, like she was transporting something fragile and important. The fruit smell filled the car immediately, thick and sweet and a little fermented, that particular smell of something right on the edge. She drove home with the windows down. See, the house on Sycamore Bend wasn't falling apart exactly. It was more like it had decided to rest. The gutters needed clearing. The porch steps had a soft spot on the left side that she'd learned to step around without thinking. The garden out back was her best-kept thing. She'd made sure of that. But the house itself wore its age the way she was starting to wear hers. Honestly, and without apology. Margaret was 61 years old. She'd spent 32 of those years married to a man named Gerald, who died on a Tuesday in February, 3 years back, from a heart attack that nobody saw coming, including Gerald. They'd had a good marriage, not a perfect one. They argued about money more than she liked to admit, and he had a habit of leaving cabinet doors open that drove her absolutely up the wall. But it was real. It was warm. And when it ended, it left a silence in the house that she hadn't fully figured out how to fill. She'd gone back to work at the school district, part-time, filing and front desk work. It paid enough. Not much more than enough. Her daughter Cass called every Sunday from Charlotte. Her son Derek called less often and felt guilty about it. She had friends, a few good ones, the kind you've known long enough that you don't have to explain yourself. She had her garden, her library card, her Tuesday night card game with Roberta and Jim and whoever else could make it. She was fine. But fine, she'd been noticing lately, had started to feel like a ceiling instead of a floor. She took the peaches to the kitchen and stood over the sink washing them one by one, her hands moving with the automatic ease of a woman who'd been in her own kitchen long enough that she didn't have to think about it. She turned each peach in her hands, testing, checking. Most of them were soft, but not rotten. The bruised spots were just bruised, the flesh underneath still fine, still fragrant, still good. "You're not garbage," she said out loud to no one in particular. She said it to the peaches, maybe. She said it to herself, possibly. The kitchen didn't judge either way. She'd canned before. Her mother had taught her, back in Georgia, the whole careful ritual of it. Jars, lids, the big pot, the towel on the bottom, the waiting. She hadn't done it in years. Since Gerald died, she hadn't done much cooking that wasn't purely functional, but something about those $3 peaches made her want to try. She pulled out her mother's old recipe card from the box in the pantry. The card was water-stained, and the handwriting was faded to a pale blue, and it smelled like nothing at all anymore, but she could still read every word. Mama's peach preserves. Add love, add patience, don't rush the set. That last instruction, don't rush the set, was underlined twice. She spent the afternoon at the stove. It wasn't graceful. The first batch of peaches she cut went faster than she expected, and she nicked her thumb on the paring knife. Nothing serious, but enough to make her say a word she didn't usually say. She had to look up whether she was supposed to blanch them first to get the skins off. She was. And then she stood over the pot of boiling water, feeling slightly ridiculous, dropping peaches in and fishing them out with a slotted spoon, watching the skin slip free like magic. The sugar went in, the lemon juice, a half teaspoon of vanilla that her mother's card didn't call for, but that Margaret added anyway because she felt like it. The smell that came off that pot was something else entirely. It started sweet and went deeper, warm and almost spicy, that particular golden smell of summer fruit being slowly transformed into something meant to last. She stood over it and stirred and let herself just be there in the kitchen, not doing anything else, not listening to the television or half reading something on her phone. Just the spoon in the pot and the smell and the late afternoon light coming through the window over the sink. When the jars finally sealed, that satisfying ping of the lids pulling down one by one, she felt something she hadn't felt in a while. Proud. Just quietly, privately, deeply proud. She ended up with 7 jars. They sat on the counter cooling, lined up like small amber lanterns. She took a picture of them on her phone, not sure why exactly, and then felt silly for doing it and didn't send the picture to anyone. Cass called that Sunday, right on schedule. "Mom, what are you up to?" "I made peach preserves." A pause. "Like actual canning?" 7 jars. "Mom!" Cass sounded genuinely pleased. "That's so... I don't know, that's so you. When did you last do that?" "Long time. Your grandmother taught me." "Are they good?" Margaret had opened 1 jar that morning and eaten some on toast, standing over the sink in her bathrobe. She'd stood there long enough that the toast went cold and she'd eaten it anyway. "They're very good, Cass." "You should sell them at the farmer's market," Cass said lightly, the way you say something off the top of your head without thinking it all the way through. "People love homemade stuff." Margaret filed that away and didn't say anything about it. She made more. The next week she went back to Hendricks and asked the produce manager, a quiet man named Sal, who wore the same Braves cap every single day, if they ever had more damaged stone fruit. Sal looked at her over the top of his glasses. "How much you need?" "Whatever you can't sell, whatever's going soft." He thought about it. "I can set stuff aside for you. People throw it away anyway. You want to pay cost?" "What's cost?" "For the soft stuff. $1 or $2 a flat, depending on what it is. Sometimes nothing if it's real far gone." Margaret shook his hand. That was the beginning of something, though she didn't know it yet. She made peach preserves with vanilla. She made them with a pinch of cardamom. She tried a batch with a little bourbon that she'd had sitting in the cabinet since Gerald's poker nights, and that one came out so good it genuinely surprised her. Warm and deep and complicated. Sweet, but not too sweet, with something underneath that made you pay attention. She labeled them by hand. Margaret's Peach Preserves. Nothing fancy. She used a pen she'd been using to write grocery lists for 20 years and a roll of masking tape, and she wrote each label a little different from the one before because that's just how handwriting works when you're not being careful. Her friend Roberta came over one Tuesday and tried the bourbon peach on a cracker and went very quiet for a moment. "Margaret." "What?" "This is extraordinary." "You're exaggerating." "I am not." Roberta pointed at her with the cracker. "This is not regular jam. This is... What is in this?" "Peaches, sugar, bourbon, some vanilla." "And what else?" "That's it." Roberta looked genuinely skeptical. "There's something else in here, some spice or something." "There's nothing else, Rob." "Then you have a gift." Roberta said it plainly, the way she said most things, without any cushioning. A genuine one, and you are currently giving it away in your living room. It was Roberta who pushed her toward the Clover Falls Saturday market. The market ran from May through October every Saturday morning in the parking lot behind the library. Margaret had been going there for years as a customer. She bought honey sometimes, and tomatoes, and once she'd bought a birdhouse she didn't need from a man who built them in his garage. "You could get a table," Roberta said. "They're $40 for the season." $40. Margaret, you work part-time at a school district. $40 is not $40 to you. It's $40. Fine. Then sell 2 jars of that bourbon peach, and you've made your money back. Margaret thought about it for 2 weeks. She made more batches. She ran the numbers: sugar, lids, jars, the fruit that Sal was setting aside for her at almost nothing. And she figured she could price the jars at $6 each and not feel dishonest about it. Maybe 7. She signed up for a table. She borrowed a card table from Jim, who had a garage full of things he'd accumulated over 40 years of marriage, and barely noticed when things went in or out. She found a tablecloth at the thrift store, blue and white checked, soft with age. She spent more time than she expected arranging 12 jars on the table the morning of her first market, moving them around, trying to make them look right. "They look great," said the man at the next table, who sold birdhouses. Actually, not the same man, different man, same general energy. "First time? Is it that obvious?" He smiled. "Little bit. But your jars look nice. What are you selling?" "Peach preserves." He nodded like that was a reasonable answer. People love peach. She sold 4 jars that first morning. Not a triumph, but not nothing either. Diane Holloway had a table at the Clover Falls Saturday market too. She'd had a table there for 6 years. She sold jams and jellies, commercial kitchen operation, proper labels with a logo she'd had designed, the whole thing. Her table was always the same, perfectly arranged, perfectly consistent, perfectly professional. She had a sign that said Holloway's Homemade in a font that somebody had clearly paid for. Margaret had bought a jar of Diane's strawberry jam once. It was fine, sweet, predictable, perfectly fine. Diane was the kind of woman who made being put together feel like a moral achievement. She was perhaps 64 or 65, sharp-faced and well-dressed even for a farmer's market, with the particular energy of someone who had decided a long time ago that they were the standard everyone else should be measured against. She noticed Margaret the second week. "Is that new?" she said, stopping in front of Margaret's table with the assessing look of someone doing an appraisal. "Second week," Margaret said. Diane picked up a jar of the plain peach, not the bourbon batch, which Margaret had almost sold out, and turned it over, read the label, looked at the handwriting, set it back down. "You made this at home?" "Yes." "Home kitchen, not commercial?" "Yes." Diane set the jar down very precisely, exactly where she'd found it. "You know you're supposed to have a cottage food license for this." "I do have one," Margaret said. She'd done the paperwork. She'd been careful about that. Diane's expression shifted just slightly. "Of course you do." A small pause. "Cute little setup." She walked away. Margaret watched her go. Cute little setup. She turned back to her table, adjusted one of the jars slightly for no particular reason. "Fine." "Oh?" The third Saturday was the morning with the samples. Roberta's idea again. "Just let people taste it, Margaret. You're not asking for anything. Just let them taste it." And Margaret had cut up some plain crackers at home and brought them in a Ziploc bag and set out a small jar of the bourbon peach as a sample. She felt ridiculous doing it. She felt like she was begging. The first woman who tried it was maybe 70, silver-haired, moved through the market with the deliberate pace of someone who had learned to take her time with things. She stopped, tried a cracker, and then she stood there for a moment with a slightly arrested expression, the look of someone recalibrating. "What's in this?" she asked. "Peaches," Margaret said. "Sugar, lemon juice, a little vanilla, and some bourbon." The woman picked up a jar, then she picked up another. "I want 2 of these." "It's $7 each." "I know, I can read." But she was smiling. "And I want 2." By noon, The bourbon peach was completely gone, every last jar. Margaret stood behind her table and looked at the empty space where they'd been. Her hands were doing that thing where they didn't quite know what to do with themselves. A girl, maybe 30, stopped and looked at the remaining jars. "Do you have any more of the bourbon ones? My mom tried one and sent me to get 2 more. "I sold out," Margaret said. "I'm sorry." The girl looked genuinely disappointed. "Do you have a website? Can I order online?" Margaret paused. "Not yet." "When you do," the girl said, "will you put me on a list or something?" She pulled a business card out of her pocket, a real business card with her email, and handed it to Margaret. Margaret took the card and looked at it after the girl walked away. Then she looked at her table, then at Diane's table, 30 feet away, where Diane was watching her with an expression Margaret couldn't quite read. She put the card in her apron pocket. She had 11 jars left. She sold 10 of them before 2 o'clock. On the way home, she stopped at a red light on Maple, and she did something she hadn't done in a very long time. She cried. Just a little. Just the kind where the tears don't fully fall, they just sit there, filling your vision. Not from sadness. She just hadn't expected it to feel like this, like something waking up. The card from the girl at the market sat on Margaret's kitchen counter for 3 days before she did anything with it. She'd prop herself against the counter in the mornings, waiting for her coffee to finish, and she'd look at it. Lily Brennan, lily.b@connectedco.com. She had no idea what Connected Co was. She wasn't sure she wanted to know. The card felt like a door she wasn't sure she was ready to open. On the 4th morning, she picked it up, turned it over, nothing on the back, and set it face down. Then she picked it back up and set it against the fruit bowl, where she could see it while she drank her coffee. She wasn't afraid of work. That wasn't it. She'd worked her whole adult life, raised 2 kids, kept a house, held a job. She knew how to do hard things. What she was afraid of, though she wouldn't have called it that out loud, was wanting something too much. Wanting something and then watching it come apart in her hands. She'd gotten real careful about that in the years since Gerald died. Careful about expecting, careful about reach. But 10 jars. 10 jars before 2 o'clock. And that woman, the silver-haired one, buying 2 without blinking. She emailed Lily Brennan that Thursday morning. She typed it out 3 times before she sent it. The final version was 4 sentences. She said she didn't have a website yet. She was making peach preserves in small batches and selling at the Saturday market, and that if Lily or her mother were interested in future batches, she was happy to set jars aside. She hit send before she could think about it again. Lily wrote back in 11 minutes. "Mrs. Calloway, my mom has been talking about your jam all week. She made my dad try it, and now he's obsessed too. Can you do a dozen jars of the bourbon peach? And do you do any other flavors? I know this is probably a lot to ask, but honestly, people keep asking me where I got it, and I've already given out your market table info to like 6 people. You might have a bigger operation than you think." Margaret read that email twice. Then she set the phone down on the counter and stood there for a minute with her hands flat on the tile. A dozen jars. She did the math without meaning to. $7 each. $84. From one email. From a woman who'd eaten a cracker sample on a Saturday morning. She picked the phone back up. "Lily, I can do a dozen jars of the bourbon peach. Give me 2 weeks. Other flavors. I've been experimenting. Do you want me to include 1 or 2 samples of something different when I bring the order?" "Yes. Please. Whatever you have." Matt. She went to see Sal on Friday. He was in the back of the store breaking down boxes with the particular efficiency of a man who had been doing the same physical task for so many years, it had become a kind of meditation. He heard her coming and didn't look up. "Margaret." "Sal, I need more fruit." He finally looked up. "How much more?" "Whatever you can get me. Peaches, but also, what else do you get that goes soft? What do you end up throwing away?" He thought about it, stacking the broken-down boxes into a neat pile with his foot. "Plums, sometimes, nectarines. Late in the season, I get a lot of pears that bruise in shipping, figs when I can get them, but figs go fast." He paused. "Tomatoes, but that's different. I'm thinking preserves, jams. Can you set things aside for me regularly? I'll take everything you'd throw out. Sal looked at her with the expression of a man recalculating something. You're getting serious about this? I think I might be. He nodded slowly, the way people do when they're not surprised, but they want you to know they're taking you seriously. Cost plus $1 a flat for the labor of sorting and setting aside. That work? That works? He held out his hand. She shook it again. On the way home, she made a list on the back of a gas station receipt she found in her cup holder. It wasn't much of a list, just flavors, really. Peach bourbon, peach vanilla, plum with star anise, maybe, pear and ginger. She'd seen a recipe once for a fig preserve with a little black pepper in it, and she'd thought about it occasionally ever since. She had a lot of cooking ahead of her. She was surprised to find she didn't mind at all. The Saturday market the following week was different. Word had gotten around in that specific small-town way where nobody can quite trace how information moves, but everyone has it. 6 people came to her table and asked specifically for the bourbon peach before she'd even finished setting up. She'd made 20 jars that week, doubled what she'd brought before, and she was starting to worry it wasn't enough. It wasn't enough. She sold out of the bourbon peach by 10:30 in the morning. By 11, she had a small cluster of people at her table. Not a crowd exactly, just 4 or 5 people gathered, which felt enormous to Margaret, who was used to standing alone behind her card table watching the birdhouse man get more foot traffic than her. An older couple tried the plain peach sample, and the man who introduced himself as Harold immediately wanted to know if she did anything savory. My wife's been looking for something to put on pork chops, he said. Not sweet, something with some edge to it. Peach with a little heat? Margaret said. Harold pointed at her like she'd said the right answer on a game show. That's it. Can you do that? I'll see what I can figure out. We'll be back next week, his wife said. She had the satisfied look of someone who had found what she came for, even if it didn't exist yet. That was the morning Diane came over. Not to the market in general. Diane was always at the market. She came specifically to Margaret's table, which she had not done before except for that first chilly assessment in week 2. She stood at the edge of the small cluster of people, waited for them to clear, and then stepped up to the table with her arms crossed loosely, her expression carefully arranged into something that was almost friendly. Busy morning, Diane said. Getting there, Margaret said. Diane looked at the remaining jars. A few plain peach, 2 of the experimental plum with black pepper that she'd brought as a test batch. Nothing else. You're selling out, seems like, of damaged fruit preserves. The way she said it wasn't quite an insult. It was more like a statement of disbelief, the tone you use when something doesn't make sense to you and you want the other person to explain it. But Margaret heard what was underneath it just fine. The fruit's not damaged when it's done, Margaret said. She kept her voice even. By the time you cook it down and jar it, it doesn't matter what it looked like before. Diane picked up the plum jar, looked at the label. Plum with black pepper? She said it like she was reading a typo. People seem to like it. Has anyone tried it yet? Margaret opened her mouth, closed it. The truth was she'd only made 6 jars of the plum as a test, and she'd given 2 away to Roberta, and she'd eaten some herself, but she hadn't put it out as a sample yet because she wasn't completely sure about it. Not here at the market, she admitted. Diane set the jar down. The corner of her mouth moved in something that wasn't quite a smile. Well, good luck with that one. She turned and walked back to her own table. Margaret looked at the plum jars, dug around in her bag for her pocket knife and a box of crackers she'd forgotten she'd brought. Opened a jar right there. The smell hit immediately, rich and sweet, and just slightly wrong in a way that made you stop and pay attention. She spread a small amount on a cracker and held it out to the woman standing nearest to her table, who'd been hovering without committing. Try this? Margaret said. The woman took it, tried it, got very still. That's interesting, she said, in the tone of someone who means it as a genuine compliment. Too much pepper? No, the pepper shows up at the end. It's really good. She reached for a jar. I'll take 2. Margaret sold all 6 plum jars in 20 minutes. She stood behind her empty table at 11:45 with $47 in her cash box and absolutely nothing left to sell. She started packing up. The birdhouse man glanced over. Good morning? Good morning, she said. Batik. She called Cass that night, which wasn't a Sunday, so it felt slightly irregular, and Cass answered on the second ring with the automatic alarm of a daughter who knows her mother doesn't call off schedule without a reason. "Mom, everything okay?" "Everything's fine," Margaret said. I have a question, a practical question." "Okay." Cass's voice relaxed. "Shoot. If I wanted to start an actual small business, not a big thing, a real small thing, what would I need to do?" A pause. "Like selling the jam?" "Preserves and yes." Another pause, longer, and Margaret could hear Cass thinking. Cass was an accountant, she thought in structures, and Margaret could almost hear the mental spreadsheet being laid out. "Okay, so you already have the cottage food license, right?" "Yes." "That covers you up to a certain annual revenue in Tennessee. I'd have to look up the exact number. After that, you'd need to upgrade, potentially go commercial kitchen. But for now, do you have a business name?" "Not officially." "You should register it. It's like $50 at the county clerk. Do you have a separate bank account?" "No." "Get one. Keep it all separate from your personal money. Make it easy to track. Do you have a way for people to pay you that isn't cash?" Margaret thought about Harold and his wife, about Lily Brennan's email, about the 6 people who'd asked specifically for the bourbon peach before she'd finished setting up that morning. "Not yet." "Mom." Cass's voice did something complicated, half exasperated, half something that might have been close to moved. "You're actually doing this." "I think I might be trying to." "Then let me help. I do this for a living, you know. Small business accounting. Will you let me help?" "That's why I called." And Cass laughed. It was a real one. "Okay, give me a few days to look everything up properly. In the meantime, go get a Square reader for your phone so people can pay with cards. It's free. You just pay a percentage of each transaction." A Square reader. "I'll text you a link." Margaret wrote Square reader on the back of the same gas station receipt that had her jam flavor list on it. The receipt was getting very full. "Cass." "Yeah?" "Do you think is this a reasonable thing, at my age, to be starting something?" The pause that followed was not hesitation. It was Cass choosing her words, which she did carefully when it mattered. "Mom, you're 61. Grandma didn't learn to drive until she was 63, and she drove herself to the grocery store until she was 89. You've got time. I'm not comparing myself to your grandmother." "I know, but I'm saying, yes, it's reasonable. It's more than reasonable." A beat. "Actually, I think it might be really good for you." Margaret didn't answer that directly. "Thank you, baby. Get the Square reader. I'll call you Thursday." Well, she registered the business name that Monday. It took 45 minutes at the county clerk's office and cost $52, and the woman behind the counter was perfectly pleasant and completely indifferent, which Margaret found oddly comforting. No one was going to make a fuss about this. She was just a woman registering a name. People did it all the time. The name she registered was Sycamore Preserves. She'd thought about other options. Margaret's, obviously, but that felt too small somehow, too much like the handwritten labels on masking tape, which she liked, actually, but maybe not for a business name. She'd thought about something with peaches. She'd thought about her mother's name. And then she'd thought about the house on Sycamore Bend, about the way it rested in the afternoon light, about Gerald's sycamore tree in the backyard that dropped those big papery seeds every fall that she was always sweeping off the porch. And that felt right. It felt rooted. She made a bank account at the credit union on Tuesday. The young man who helped her set it up was maybe 26, and he asked politely what kind of business she was in. "Fruit preserves," she said. "Jams, specialty small batch." He nodded like that made complete sense. "My grandmother makes jam," he said. "People underestimate jam." "They do," Margaret agreed. She got the Square reader in the mail on Wednesday. It was smaller than she expected. Just a little white square that plugged into her phone. And she set it up in 20 minutes following the instructions, which turned out to be clear enough even for a woman who did not consider herself particularly good with technology. Thursday night, she made 3 batches. The peach bourbon, a new batch of the plain peach, but this time she added a half teaspoon of cinnamon to half the jars to see if she liked it. and a small test batch of peach with jalapeno. Just 4 jars, because Harold had asked about something with heat and she'd been thinking about it all week. The jalapeno batch scared her a little. She'd never done anything with heat before. She'd added the peppers cautiously, way less than she thought she probably needed, and then tasted it at various stages and added a little more, and then thought she'd added too much, and then tasted it again, and thought maybe it was right. It was bright and strange, and almost too sweet, and then the heat would come and shift everything. She wasn't sure about it. She brought it anyway. Saturday morning, she set up earlier than usual, arriving at the market at 7:15 when most vendors were still in the slow assembly phase of their morning. She'd made a sign overnight, proper cardboard, black marker, nothing fancy, that said Sycamore Preserves, and she'd punched holes in the corners and hung it from the front of the card table with 2 pieces of kitchen twine. It looked, she thought, like something real. She'd also made new labels, still handwritten, still on masking tape, but now they said Sycamore Preserves at the top, and the flavor and the batch date underneath. Small details. But she felt them. Roberta showed up at 7:30 with 2 coffees and took in the new sign with the expression of someone very pleased with the world. "Look at you," Roberta said. "Don't make a thing of it." "I am absolutely making a thing of it." She handed Margaret one of the coffees. "You have a name." "It's just a sign, Rob." "No, it isn't." Roberta looked at the table, at the jars arranged in their rows, at the tablecloth and the sign and the handwritten labels. "This is the beginning of something. I'm allowed to notice that." Margaret took the coffee and held it with both hands. "I brought a jalapeno peach." Roberta's eyebrows went up. "Really?" 4 jars. Test batch. I'm not sure about it." "Can I try?" Margaret handed her a cracker and opened the jar. Roberta spread some on, took a bite, chewed thoughtfully. Her expression moved through a small series of things. First something polite, then something genuinely surprised, then something that looked like focus, like paying close attention. "Margaret," she said, "too much?" "No." Roberta looked at her. "No, there's like 3 seconds of sweet and then the heat. It sneaks up on you. It's really good, like really good. You're not just saying that." "When do I just say things?" Fair point. Roberta had told her gently but directly when her potato salad was too salty. She had told her when her haircut wasn't flattering. She was not a woman who said things to be nice. Margaret put a little sign next to the jalapeno batch. New, peach. Jalapeno. Ask for a sample. She sold all 4 jars before 9 o'clock. At 9:15, Harold came back with his wife. He went straight for the jalapeno. Tried a sample. Looked at his wife. She looked back at him. "That's it," he said to Margaret. "That's the one with heat?" "That's the one. Give me 6. Harold, I only brought 4 and they're gone." He stared at the empty spot on the table. He looked genuinely bereaved for a moment. "You're out? Already?" "I wasn't sure how it would do." "It does great," he said. "When's the next batch?" "Next week." "How many jars?" Margaret looked at him. "How many do you want?" "All of them," he said, and he wasn't joking. It was around 10 that morning that the trouble came back, as trouble tends to do. Diane appeared at the edge of the growing little cluster of people around Margaret's table. And it was a cluster now, a genuine one. 6 or 7 people browsing, someone asking questions, the sample jar getting low. And she stood there with her arms crossed and her face doing the thing it had been doing since week 2. That particular expression that was not quite displeasure, but was not anywhere near neutral either. Margaret saw her. She was helping a woman decide between the plain peach and the cinnamon peach. And she saw Diane in her peripheral vision and kept her face easy and her voice steady. When the woman left with both jars, she'd taken both, she couldn't decide, Diane stepped up. "You're doing cottage food," Diane said. It wasn't really a question. "I am," Margaret said. "Are you licensed for the jalapeno? Hot pepper products have different classification in some jurisdictions." Margaret looked at her steadily. "I checked," which was true. She had checked. She'd spent an hour on the Tennessee Department of Agriculture website at 11 o'clock on Wednesday night specifically because she'd thought of this question and wanted to be sure. Just checking, Diane said. Wouldn't want you to have a problem with the market committee. I appreciate your concern, Margaret said. Diane picked up a jar of the bourbon peach, read the label, set it down. You know, I tried to do a bourbon peach once, years ago. Did you? Didn't work. The bourbon flavor doesn't survive the canning process, cooks off completely. She said it with the authority of someone sharing useful information. You might want to tell your customers what they're actually tasting. Margaret was quiet for a beat, just one beat. Try a sample, she said. She held out a cracker. Diane looked at it. Something moved behind her eyes. Not quite reluctance, more like the decision to prove a point. She took the cracker. She tried it. She stood there for a moment. Well, she said, it's sweet. Yes. I don't taste bourbon. Most people say they do. Diane set the cracker remnant down on the edge of the table. What proof were you using? 100 proof, added it in the last few minutes of the cook, low enough heat that it doesn't cook off completely. Diane blinked, just once and briefly, but Margaret caught it. Interesting. It took me a few tries to figure it out. Diane straightened up, smoothed the front of her jacket, which didn't need smoothing. Well, cute flavors. She turned and walked back to her table. Margaret watched her go. She sold her last jar at $11.50. On the way to her car, she counted the cash box. $109. Plus what she'd run on the Square reader. She'd had 4 card payments, which she'd have to check later. She stood by the Civic in the library parking lot in the late morning sun and thought about what Diane had said about the bourbon cooking off. She knew what she tasted in those jars. She knew what everyone else was tasting. A woman who'd been cooking for 40 years knew the difference between a flavored jam and an imagined one. She put the cash box in her bag and started the car. Some things you just had to let be what they were, and let the jars speak for themselves. She had a dozen to deliver to Lily Brennan by Wednesday. She needed to go home and get to work. Derek arrived on Thursday evening with a rolling carry-on and a laptop bag, and the particular energy of a man who had decided to be useful and was slightly nervous about whether he'd be welcome. Margaret opened the door, and he stood on the porch, looking a little older than she remembered, which was the thing that happened every time. The gap between the person you carried in your head and the person standing in front of you. You need to fix that step, he said, looking down at the soft spot on the left side. I know. I'll look at it tomorrow. You don't have to. Mom. He picked up his bag. I'll look at it tomorrow. She fed him the leftover chicken she'd made the night before, and he ate it standing at the kitchen counter the way he'd eaten things standing at her kitchen counter since he was 15 years old. He looked at the rows of jars on the shelf she'd installed on the wall, Gerald's old tool shelf, repurposed, and he was quiet for a moment in the particular way of someone processing a revision to something they thought they already understood. How many is that? He asked. 32 ready to ship, 26 set aside for Saturday. 58 jars in your kitchen. It's a small operation. He turned around and looked at her with the expression she recognized from when he was about 12, that look he got when something impressed him more than he expected, and he wasn't quite sure how to carry it. Cass said you had a magazine call you. Tennessee Table, the food editor. We had the conversation Tuesday. And? They want to come in 3 weeks. Bring a photographer. Margaret refilled her own water glass at the sink. She wants to photograph me cooking. In here. Derek looked around the kitchen. It was a regular kitchen, good-sized, clean, the same yellow walls she'd painted in 2011 and never gotten around to changing. The shelf of jars. The pot hanging on the rack that Gerald had put up as a birthday present because she'd mentioned once, offhand, that she wanted one. Nothing magazine-worthy, she would have said, if she were being her usual practical self. That's incredible, Mom. It's one magazine. It's a start. That's what everyone keeps telling me. She turned off the tap. I'm aware it's a start. I'm also aware that I'm running out of fruit processing capacity in this kitchen, and I have 58 jars in an online store I don't know how to set up yet, and a market in 2 days. Derek set his fork down. Okay, let's do the store tonight. It's 9 o'clock. Do you need to sleep right now? She did not need to sleep right now. She was 61, not 81, and she'd been running on a particular forward-leaning energy for weeks that felt almost physical, like something was pulling her from the front. Get your laptop, she said. They worked at the kitchen table until 11:45. Derek pulled up Etsy first, walked her through the interface, explained what listings were and how to photograph things for them, and what search terms mattered. He talked about product descriptions. Specific beats vague, always, he said. Tell people exactly what's in it and why it's different from what they can buy at Walmart. And he talked about pricing and shipping and the flat-rate USPS boxes that were free to order and came to your door. You'd pack them yourself? He asked. At first, yes. Jars are heavy. Shipping costs could undercut your margin if you're not careful. Walk me through the math. He walked her through the math. She wrote things down on the legal pad she kept on the kitchen table, her handwriting getting slightly messier as the night went on, the way it did when her brain was moving faster than her hand. She asked questions he didn't expect her to ask. What's the conversion rate on Etsy for specialty food items? How do you handle returns when the product is perishable? Is there a way to batch fulfill orders so I'm not making 12 separate post office trips? And he answered them and looked at her occasionally with an expression she eventually identified as something between admiration and the slightly humbling realization that his mother was sharper than he'd been giving her credit for. She set up 6 listings: peach bourbon, peach vanilla, peach jalapeno, plain peach, plum black pepper, and a variety pack of 3 that she'd price at $22, less than buying all 3 individually, which Derek said was smart. That's upselling done right, he said. It's just reasonable, she said. Mom, that is literally what upselling done right is. She took the product photos herself the next morning before Derek was up, in the same window light that Lily had used. She'd been paying attention to what worked in Lily's photos, the angle, the way the jars caught the light, letting the amber color of the preserve show through the glass rather than just photographing the label. She took 27 pictures of 6 jars and used 8 of them. She'd stopped feeling silly about things like this somewhere around week 3 and had started feeling like someone learning the actual rules of something. Derek came downstairs at 8, looked at the photos on her phone and said, "Those are really good," in a tone that suggested he'd been prepared to tactfully suggest she retake them. My daughter-in-law doesn't know everything, Margaret said pleasantly, which wasn't directed at anyone in particular, and Derek laughed hard enough that he had to put down his coffee. The store went live at 9:17 Friday morning. By noon, she had 4 orders. She stood in the kitchen with the order confirmation emails open on her phone and looked at them. 4 strangers in 4 different places, one in Memphis, one in Atlanta, one in Ohio of all places, had found her store and decided to spend their money on her jars. Ohio. She'd made these preserves from damaged peaches she'd bought for $3 from the back corner of a produce store in Clover Falls, Tennessee, and now someone in Ohio was going to eat them on their toast. She sat down at the table because her legs felt slightly unreliable. Derek appeared in the doorway with a sandwich. How many? 4 orders. He sat down across from her. That's day 1. I know. By the time the magazine piece runs, I know, Derek. She looked at him. I'm taking it in. Give me a minute to take it in. He was quiet. He ate his sandwich. That was one of the things about Derek, always had been. When you told him to give you a minute, he actually gave you a minute, which was not a small thing. After a while, she said, I need to figure out shipping materials. Bubble wrap, boxes, something to cushion the jars so they don't crack in transit. Hardware store, he said. And order the USPS flat rate boxes online tonight. They'll come in a few days. Will they be here before I need to ship? You have 4 days before the post office expects anything. Okay. She stood up. I need to make more jalapeno. I'm going to sell out tomorrow and I want to have stock ready for the online orders. Now? Why not now? He looked at her for a moment, then he stood up too. Can I help? She handed him an apron, Gerald's old one, blue denim, slightly too big for either of them, and didn't say anything about it. He looked at it for just a second, and then he put it on. Saturday morning was different from any Saturday that had come before it. Margaret knew it before she even got out of the car. She could see it from the parking lot. A cluster of people already at her table before the market officially opened, which was not supposed to happen, but which the market organizers generally chose not to enforce too vigorously. 3 women standing there looking at jars. 1 man on his phone, she suspected reading something, probably the Instagram account. Derek carried a box to the table and set it down and looked at the crowd with the expression of someone revising their expectations upward. "This happen every week?" he asked. "No," Margaret said. "This is new." Roberta was already there, of course, with coffees, watching the approaching situation with the calm of a woman who had lived long enough to enjoy the moments that surprise people. "Morning," she said. "You went from 231 to 1140 overnight. On Instagram? Your post last night, the one with the kitchen and the shelf of jars." Margaret had posted it almost by accident. She'd taken a picture of the shelf at 10 o'clock while they were getting the last batch of jalapeno ready, because the light was right and the shelf looked full and satisfying, and she'd posted it without overthinking the caption. She'd written, 48 hours from damaged fruit to this. Not bad for a Tuesday. She'd thought it was just a nice picture. 1140 followers. "Someone big reposted it again," Roberta said. "Who?" "I don't know. Some food account, lots of followers." Margaret didn't have time to look into it because the market bell rang and the 3 women who'd been waiting came directly to her table, and the morning started moving the way mornings had been moving lately. Fast, with a momentum that didn't feel entirely under her control, which was both thrilling and faintly alarming. She sold out of the jalapeno in 40 minutes. She sold out of the bourbon peach in an hour and 10. At 10:30, she had 7 jars of plum black pepper and 4 plain peach and nothing else. She had a list on the clipboard with 23 names. Harold came at 10:45, looked at the remaining jars, and sighed with his whole body. "You're out of jalapeno," he said. "Harold, I know. I should have come earlier." He looked so genuinely aggrieved that she had to work to keep from laughing. "I brought my brother-in-law. He drove here from Murfreesboro specifically." "I'm so sorry." The brother-in-law, a large, good-natured man named Frank, who was introduced simply as Frank, from Murfreesboro, looked at the plum black pepper jar with the expression of someone making peace with an alternative. "What's this one?" "Plum, with a little black pepper. It's more complex than the peach. Goes well with cheese, pork, really good on a cheese board." Frank picked it up, looked at the label. "I'll try anything." She gave him a sample. He tried it and stood there for a moment with the specific stillness of someone who has just registered something unexpected. "That's not what I expected," he said. "Good different or bad different?" "Good different." He looked at Harold. "This is actually better than I expected." He took 2 jars. Then he looked at her. "I'm putting a name on the list. For the jalapeno. When you have it." "Next Saturday at the latest. I'll be here." Murfreesboro was 40 minutes in the other direction from Ridgecrest. Margaret added Frank's name to the clipboard and thought briefly about the radius of people who were now driving to Clover Falls specifically for her jars, and the thought was so strange and large that she filed it away to look at later when she had a quiet moment. It was 11 o'clock when Diane made her move. Margaret saw her coming from across the market and knew from the way she was walking, deliberate, slightly stiff, with someone alongside her, that this was not a casual pass-by. The person alongside her was a man Margaret didn't know, 50s, wearing a polo shirt with the Clover Falls Saturday Market logo on the chest. Committee. She kept her expression neutral, kept her hands busy straightening the remaining jars. "Margaret," Diane's voice was bright and even, "this is Gary Hutchins. He's the market committee chair." Gary put out his hand and Margaret shook it. He had the manner of a man who'd been doing thankless organizational work for years and had developed an automatic diplomacy about it. "Mrs. Calloway, good morning." "Good morning. I wanted to come by and introduce myself. Diane mentioned your table had been quite busy the last few weeks." "It's been a good run," Margaret said. "That's great to hear. We love seeing vendors succeed." He smiled. It seemed genuine. "Diane had some questions about the cottage food status of a few of your products, specifically the jalapeno. She mentioned some concern about whether it falls under Tennessee cottage food exemptions." Margaret had been expecting this. Not the exact shape of it, but something in this general area. She'd read the Tennessee Department of Agriculture cottage food guidelines 3 times, and she'd called the department's consumer helpline on Wednesday morning and spoken to a woman named Sharon for 22 minutes. Peach jalapeno is a high-acid preserve, Margaret said. Tennessee cottage food law covers pickles, jams, jellies, and preserves made with high-acid fruit. Peaches are high-acid. The addition of jalapeno doesn't change the acidity classification as long as the pH is maintained. I've tested the pH of my batch. She'd bought a pack of pH strips on Amazon and tested 3 jars from the latest batch at Sharon's suggestion. I have the documentation at home. Gary blinked, just briefly. You tested the pH? I did. Oh. He glanced at Diane. Something passed between them that Margaret couldn't fully read but didn't need to. Well, that sounds like you've done your research. I called the Department of Agriculture, Margaret said. Spoke with someone in the consumer division. I can give you her name if you'd like to verify. Gary looked slightly uncomfortable now, in the way of a man who'd come prepared to mediate something and found there was nothing to mediate. That won't be necessary. It sounds like you're in full compliance. I believe I am. He nodded, smiled again, the same professional smile. Well, like I said, we love seeing vendors do well. If you have any questions about the market rules or want to discuss anything with the committee, my email's on the website. Thank you, Gary. He looked at Diane. Diane was looking at the table, at the nearly empty shelf of jars, and her expression had settled into something that was harder to read than usual. Not the studied neutrality she'd been using, something more actual than that, something Margaret recognized with a small start of surprise as being very close to frustration. Not at being caught, exactly, more like the frustration of someone who had expected a wall and found open air instead. Great setup, Gary said, giving the table a general approving nod. He walked away. Diane didn't move for a moment. You called the Department of Agriculture, she said. Wednesday morning, Margaret said. Spent about 20 minutes on the phone. You were that prepared. I was careful, Margaret said. Not harsh, just the fact of it. I've tried to be careful from the beginning. Diane looked at her. The expression on her face was doing several things at once, and Margaret didn't try to identify all of them. After a moment, Diane said, You have a very good instinct for the jalapeno ratio. Most people put in too much, and it overwhelms the fruit. It was so unexpected that Margaret almost didn't catch it in time. Thank you. It's a technical observation, Diane said, already turning away. Not a compliment. Of course, Margaret said. She watched Diane go back to her table. She turned back to her own. Derek was at the end of the table, having watched the whole exchange from a discreet distance with his arms crossed. He raised his eyebrows at her. She gave him a small shake of her head that meant later. She sold her last 4 jars before noon. Derek fixed the porch step on Sunday morning with wood filler and a piece of pressure-treated board he bought at the hardware store. Margaret brought him coffee and stood on the porch watching him work. He was good with his hands in the imprecise, trial-and-error way of someone self-taught. He'd learned from YouTube videos she knew, the same way he'd learned most practical things. Gerald had not been handy. It was one of the few areas where Margaret had actually been the more capable one, and she'd passed some of that competence down through proximity rather than intention. The step's solid now, he said, standing and testing his weight on it. Should hold a long time. Thank you. He picked up his coffee. They stood on the porch in the late morning, the backyard visible through the gap in the fence, the sycamore tree doing its enormous, unhurried thing in the corner. It was a clear September morning, that particular quality of Tennessee fall light that made everything look slightly more real than usual. Tell me about the woman, Derek said. Which woman? Mom. Diane. Margaret held her coffee with both hands. She's been at the market for 6 years. She sells jams and jellies, too. Her operation is more professional in the commercial sense. Labels, commercial kitchen, the whole thing. I think I surprised her. She tried to get you kicked out. She tried to get me questioned. It's different. Is it? Margaret considered this. She didn't lie. She just used true information in a way that was designed to create a problem that didn't actually exist. That's a specific kind of move. It means she's paying close attention to me. Derek looked at her. That doesn't bother you? It tells me something about where I am, Margaret said. 6 weeks ago, she called my table a cute little setup and walked away. Now she's going to the committee chair. She took a sip of coffee. That's progress. Uncomfortable progress, but progress. What do you think she actually wants? Margaret thought about Diane's face when she'd said, "You have a very good instinct for the jalapeno ratio." About the particular quality of the frustration she'd seen. About 6 years at the same market, the same table, the same territory. I think she built something real, Margaret said slowly. And she's been the person at that market for a long time, and that meant something to her. And now I showed up and things are moving fast, and I think that feels threatening even if it isn't. She paused. I also think she knows her jam is fine, and she knows mine is something different, and that's a harder thing to sit with. Derek was quiet for a moment. You're being more generous than I'd be. Probably, Margaret stood up straighter. But she's not wrong that I needed to be careful. If I hadn't checked the regulations, actually checked them, not just assumed, she could have made real trouble for me. So, she shrugged slightly. I take the useful part and leave the rest. Derek looked at the sycamore tree. Dad would have liked watching this, he said. It came out quieter than his other words, a little more careful. Margaret didn't answer right away. She let the morning sit there for a moment, the way you do with things that are true and don't need adding to. He would have tasted every batch, she said finally, and he would have told me the first one was the best one and then eaten 4 jars of the jalapeno before I could stop him. Derek laughed, a short, real one. Absolutely true. They stood there a little while longer before the day pulled them back into it. The Tennessee table photographer arrived 3 weeks later on a Thursday morning. His name was Caleb. He was maybe 35, and he came through the door with 2 camera bags and a rolling case of lighting equipment, and immediately made the kitchen feel half its usual size. He was professional and cheerful, and moved things without asking, which Margaret had to consciously let go of. He shifted the fruit bowl, he moved a chair, he took her dish rack off the counter and put it in the hall closet, and when she started to say something about it, he said, I'll put everything back exactly where it was. I promise. With such genuine confidence that she believed him. Beth Garland came an hour later. She was 40-ish, dark-haired, brisk in the efficient way of someone who ran on good intentions and tight deadlines. She shook Margaret's hand, looked around the kitchen with the assessing eyes of someone who did this for a living, and said, This is exactly right. It's just my kitchen, Margaret said. That's what I mean. It's real. She sat at the table and pulled out a recorder. Can we talk for a bit before you start cooking? I want to understand the origin of this, how it started. So Margaret told her. The flat of damaged peaches. The $3. Her mother's recipe card. Gerald dying, and the silence in the house, and the way making something with her hands had felt like reaching a hand through that silence and grabbing onto something solid. She didn't plan to say that last part. It came out before she decided to say it, which was the risk of talking to a skilled interviewer. Beth didn't react outwardly. She just nodded and made a small sound that said, keep going. I wasn't trying to build a business, Margaret said. I was trying to make something that lasted. You know, preserves. The word itself. You're preserving something, taking what's about to be lost and making it last. That's a beautiful way to put it. I'm not trying to be poetic. It's just the actual reason. Beth smiled. The actual reason is usually the most interesting one. Caleb photographed her cooking for 2 hours. He photographed her hands on the pot, the spoon moving through the thickening jam, the jars lined up on the counter. He photographed the masking tape labels being written in her handwriting. He photographed the shelf with the finished jars and the old recipe card. She'd brought it out without being asked, just because she wanted it nearby. And he photographed the recipe card for a long time, adjusting angles, with the seriousness of someone who understood what he was looking at. When he finally photographed Margaret herself, sitting at the kitchen table with a jar in her hands and the shelf of preserves behind her, he said, Don't look at the camera, just look at the jar. She looked at the jar. She'd looked at a lot of jars over the past weeks, but she looked at this one specifically. at the color of the preserves through the glass, that warm, deep amber. And she thought about $3 and her mother's handwriting and Harold's bereaved face at the empty table and Lily's email arriving in 11 minutes and the woman in the silver hair buying two without blinking. She wasn't performing any of that. She was just thinking about it. Caleb took 12 shots in about 40 seconds. Then he looked at his camera screen and showed it to Beth, and Beth looked at it and said, "That's the cover." Margaret looked over. It was just her at a table in her kitchen holding a jar. She looked tired, she thought, in the way of someone who'd been working hard. Her hair wasn't perfect. She was 61 years old, and you could see it. "I'm not sure I'm cover material," she said. Beth turned the camera back to look at the image herself. A woman in her 60s making something extraordinary out of what everyone else threw away, built from nothing, starting over at a point in life when most people stopped trying. She looked at Margaret. "You're absolutely cover material. You're exactly what our readers need to see." Margaret looked at the jar in her hands in the photograph, at her own face, which she barely recognized as the face she thought she had. It looked more settled than she felt, more certain, like someone who knew what she was doing. Maybe that wasn't so far from the truth anymore. She set the jar down on the table. "When does the issue come out?" 6 weeks, Beth said. "And Margaret, I want to warn you, after this runs, your volume is going to increase significantly. Are you prepared for that?" Margaret thought about the kitchen, about the one pot and the home stove and the jars and the cardboard boxes, and Sal setting aside soft fruit at cost plus $1, about the Etsy store that now had 61 sales in 3 weeks, about the legal pad with the math she'd done and then felt embarrassed about and then done again more carefully. "I'm going to need to be," she said. That wasn't quite the same as yes, but it was the honest answer, and she'd found, lately, that honest answers were the ones worth giving. The magazine came out on a Tuesday. Margaret knew the date because Beth had texted her the week before. Issue drops November 4th. You'll be able to find it at most newsstands in Tennessee, and the feature will go live on our website at 6 a.m. And she'd written it on the calendar in the kitchen, the paper one she kept on the wall next to the refrigerator, the kind with the small squares that she'd been using for 30 years because she didn't trust herself to remember things that only existed on a phone. She didn't sleep well the night before, not from excitement exactly. It was more like the particular restlessness of waiting for something you can't control. She'd done everything she could do. The cooking, the photographing, the talking, the honest answers. Whatever Beth and Caleb had made of those 3 hours in her kitchen was already made, already printed, already sitting in stacks in distribution warehouses somewhere between here and everywhere. She had no more say in it. She got up at 5:30 and made coffee and sat at the kitchen table in the dark with her hands around the mug. At 6 o'clock, she opened the Tennessee Table website on her phone. Her own face looked back at her. The photograph Caleb had taken, her at the table holding the jar, looking at it rather than the camera, filled the screen above the fold. The headline beneath it read, "From the discard pile, how one Tennessee woman turned damaged fruit into something people can't stop talking about." The subheadline said, "Margaret Calloway of Clover Falls didn't set out to build a business. She set out to not waste a $3 flat of peaches." What happened next surprised everyone, including her. She read the article sitting at the kitchen table as the kitchen got lighter around her. Beth had written it with a directness that Margaret appreciated. No sentimentality she hadn't earned, no language that made her sound like a symbol rather than a person. She'd included the quote about preserving, about taking what was about to be lost and making it last, and reading it back in print felt strange, like hearing your own voice on a recording and not quite recognizing it. Her phone buzzed at 6:14. Lily. "It's up, Margaret." The photo. "You look incredible." Her phone buzzed again at 6:17, then 6:19, then 3 times in quick succession. By 6:30, she had 47 new notifications on Instagram. By 7, she had 412. By 8 o'clock, when she'd showered and dressed and come back to the kitchen to eat something because she realized she hadn't, her Etsy store had 31 new orders. She stood at the counter eating toast and reading order notifications and trying to feel something appropriate to the moment. What she actually felt was a complicated mixture of things that didn't have a clean name. The warmth of it, yes. The genuine pleasure of being seen and understood correctly, but underneath that, a cold, practical awareness that 31 orders meant 31 boxes she had to pack, and 31 trips to or from the post office, and 31 jars that she currently did not have, because she had 44 on the shelf and had already promised 26 to regular market customers. She did the math. She needed more fruit. She needed more jars. She needed more time, specifically more hours in the day than the day contained. She called Sal at 8:45 as soon as she figured the store was open. "I saw the magazine," he said before she could speak. "You saw it already?" "My wife showed me. She reads it every month." A pause. "Congratulations, Margaret." "Thank you, Sal. I need to talk to you about volume." "How much volume?" "I don't know exactly yet. More than I've been buying. Significantly more." She sat down at the table with the legal pad in front of her. "Can we sit down this week and talk about what you can reliably get me? Come in Wednesday morning. I'll have the week's damage assessment by then. What came in soft? What's going to turn before the weekend? We can figure something out." "I appreciate it." "You're keeping me from throwing things away," he said, in the straightforward manner of a man who found waste genuinely offensive. "We both benefit." She hung up and sat for a moment and then wrote at the top of the legal pad, in capital letters, "Capacity problem." She underlined it once. Then she started writing underneath it, the way she'd always solved problems. List the pieces, look at the pieces, figure out which piece moves first. She called Cass at 9. "I saw," Cass said immediately. "Mom, the photo." "I know." "You look like yourself." "Is that good?" "That's the best thing. You look like the most yourself version of yourself." Cass's voice had the slightly thick quality of someone who had recently been crying, which Margaret pretended not to notice because Cass would be embarrassed about it. "How many orders?" 31 as of 7 minutes ago. Probably more by now." "Okay." Cass was already in accountant mode. Margaret could hear the shift. "You need to think about this carefully. Too many orders and not enough inventory is a problem people don't always take seriously enough at first. You can create demand you can't fill, and that damages trust." "I know. I'm already thinking about it." "You could put the store on pause." "I don't want to put it on pause." Margaret thought about the woman from Ridgecrest, about Ohio, about the comment she'd seen last week from someone in Vermont who'd said they'd been looking for something exactly like this for years. "I want to figure out how to meet it. That's a different problem." Cass was quiet for a moment. "You're going to need help." "I know." "Real help, not just Derek for a weekend." "I know, Cass." A beat. Then Cass said carefully, "Are you thinking what I think you're thinking?" Margaret looked around the kitchen, at the pot hanging from Gerald's rack, at the shelf, at the window and the yard beyond it, and the sycamore tree doing its enormous unhurried thing in the corner. "I've been thinking it for a few weeks," she said. "I just wasn't ready to say it." "A commercial kitchen. Either renting time in one or—" She stopped. "Let's talk when you come for Thanksgiving." "I'm coming for Thanksgiving regardless." "I know. I'm saying let's talk seriously then. Bring your spreadsheets." Cass laughed. Real, warm, the specific laugh she had when she was both amused and moved simultaneously. "I always bring spreadsheets. That's why I said it." She put the Etsy store on a 4-day processing delay, which was a compromise between pausing it entirely and pretending she could fill orders faster than she could. She wrote a note in the store header. "Small batch, handmade. Please allow 4 to 5 days for processing before shipment. Every jar made in my kitchen in Clover Falls, Tennessee. Thank you for your patience." And she meant every word of it, especially the thank you, because patience was something she was asking for, and she didn't take it lightly. The orders kept coming anyway. By Thursday, she had 89. She called Derek. "I need to talk through a numbers problem." "Good timing. I was going to call you. I've been looking at your Etsy analytics, and Margaret, your conversion rate is—" "Derek, I need help packing and shipping, not analytics. Physical help. Can you come back this weekend?" A pause. Yeah, I can do that." He came back Saturday morning with his laptop and stayed through Sunday night. They packed jars at the kitchen table, bubble wrap, newspaper, the flat-rate USPS boxes that Margaret had ordered 2 weeks ago and now had stacked in the hall closet. And she showed him the system she'd developed for labeling and taping and making sure nothing shifted in transit. They did it assembly line style, Derek cutting the bubble wrap and wrapping jars while Margaret made up the labels and nested everything into boxes. It was repetitive work. It was also, unexpectedly, very good. They talked while they worked. Not about anything urgent, just the way you talk when your hands are busy and the pressure of eye contact is off. He told her about Austin, about a woman he'd been seeing for 4 months that he hadn't mentioned before. She told him about the card game on Tuesday nights, about Jim's new knee, and how he still beat everyone at Rummy despite it. She told him about Diane, the full story this time with all the pieces, and he listened without interrupting except once. "Did she ever actually buy a jar?" he asked. "No." "Has anyone asked her why?" Margaret stopped wrapping. She hadn't thought about it from that angle. "No." "Might be interesting to know," Derek said, in the mild tone he used when he thought something was more interesting than he was letting on. She thought about that while she taped the next box. About Diane, who had been watching her from 30 feet away for 3 months now, who had gone to the committee chair, who had said, "You have a very good instinct for the jalapeno ratio," in a voice that was trying very hard to be merely technical. She thought about 6 years at the same market, about building something and then watching someone show up and do a version of the same thing differently, and the different version pulling people in ways yours hadn't. That was its own kind of loss, she supposed, or its own kind of mirror, which might be worse. She taped the box shut, wrote the address, set it in the pile. The Saturday market, after the magazine came out, was the biggest one yet, and Margaret had prepared for it the way she'd started preparing for everything, methodically, the night before, with a list and a plan and enough wiggle room to account for what the plan wouldn't anticipate. She'd made 82 jars that week. That number had taken 5 evenings and 2 full Saturdays of cooking and every large pot she owned and 1 borrowed from Roberta. She was sore in her shoulders and her lower back from standing at the stove, and she'd burned her forearm on the pot handle on Wednesday night. A small burn, not serious, with a blister that she'd put a bandage over and not mentioned to anyone. And she had, twice this week, gone to bed so tired that she'd fallen asleep with the light on and woken up at 3 in the morning to turn it off. But she had 82 jars. She got to the market at 6:45 before Dawn had fully finished, and she was not the first person there. There were 4 people waiting, not vendors, customers. Waiting before the market opened at 7:30, standing in the library parking lot in the November chill with their hands in their pockets. One of them was Paula, Lily's mother, who waved when she saw Margaret and didn't seem embarrassed at all about being in a parking lot before 7 in the morning. Another was a man she didn't recognize, maybe 40, wearing a Vanderbilt sweatshirt. The other 2 were a couple, older, who'd brought a thermos of coffee and were sharing it with the equanimity of people who had decided to make an occasion of waiting. "We read the article," the woman from the couple said, by way of explanation. "Thank you for coming," Margaret said. "We came last week and you were sold out," the man added. "We were not making that mistake again." She set up her table with Derek's help. He'd come again, same rolling bag, same reliable presence, and by 7:15 there were 11 people waiting. The birdhouse man, setting up his own table nearby, glanced over and said quietly and without any particular expression, "You've got a situation." "Little bit," Margaret said. The market opened and the morning moved like a river. Not frantic. Margaret had the table organized, the pre-order names on the clipboard, the sample jars clearly labeled, the square reader charged and ready. But steady and fast, with people arriving in waves, and more than a few of them saying some version of, "I saw the article," or "I saw your Instagram," or twice, "My coworker wouldn't stop talking about your jam until I came here myself." That second one made her pause both times. The idea of her peach preserves becoming something someone talked about at work, at a desk somewhere, in a break room, mentioned casually in the flow of an ordinary day, was stranger and more real to her than the magazine cover. The magazine felt like an event. The break room felt like life. She was in the middle of helping a woman choose between the plum black pepper and the fig preserve, a new flavor she'd introduced 2 weeks ago, fig with a little rosemary and a hint of balsamic, which had taken 3 test batches to get right and which she was still slightly nervous about. when she became aware that Diane Holloway was standing at the end of her table. Not the assessing stand, not the committee chair alongside her stand, just standing slightly to the side, waiting with the particular quality of someone who is not entirely comfortable with their own presence in a place. Margaret finished with the fig plum woman. She took one of each and turned to Diane. Diane was holding something, a jar, her own jar from her own table. Margaret recognized the label, the Holloway's homemade font, in its careful professional typeface. She was holding it with both hands, turned slightly, the way you hold something when you're not sure what to do with it next. "I wanted to say something," Diane said. Margaret waited. Diane stopped, started again. "I wasn't fair to you in the beginning. The things I said about the damaged fruit. The committee business." She looked at the jar in her hands, not at Margaret. "I was trying to protect territory that I decided was mine, and that wasn't your problem to manage." Margaret didn't say anything yet. She'd found, over 61 years, that some moments wanted a little silence before an answer. "I've been at this market for 6 years," Diane continued. "I built something here. It wasn't anything like what you've built in 3 months, but it was mine and I was proud of it. And when you showed up, She pressed her lips together briefly. "I think I made you into a problem instead of looking at what you were actually doing, which was something worth looking at." "You were paying attention," Margaret said. "Even when it wasn't kind, you were paying attention. You made me be careful, more careful than I might have been." Diane looked up from the jar. "You called the Department of Agriculture." "Wednesday morning." "Because you knew I'd push. Because I knew I needed to be right." Margaret paused. "But yes, because I knew you'd push." Something in Diane's face shifted. Not dramatically, but in the way of something releasing. "Your jalapeno ratio really is good," she said. "I'd like to know how you worked it out." "Trial and error mostly. 4 test batches. The 3rd batch I got too excited and doubled the jalapeno, and it tasted like fruit and anger." Diane made a sound that was unmistakably a laugh. A short one, surprised out of her. "Fruit and anger," she repeated. "I gave it to my son. He ate it anyway." "Of course he did." Diane set the jar she was holding down on the edge of Margaret's table, not placing it back in her own territory, just setting it down between them. "I'd like to buy one of the jalapeno," she said. "If you have any left." Margaret had 3 left. She'd been holding them for Donna from Ridgecrest, who was on the list. But Donna had already emailed this morning saying she'd ordered 2 jars online and wouldn't make it today. She reached under the table and got one of the 3 and set it in front of Diane. $7, she said. Not 8. It was the original price, the market price, the one she charged when she still wasn't sure. Diane opened her purse, paid in exact change, which somehow felt like a statement. She picked up the jar, looked at it for a moment, and then she looked at Margaret. "Good luck," she said. And she meant it. Margaret could hear that she meant it, the specific register of something said simply because it's true. "Thank you, Diane." Diane walked back to her table. Margaret watched her go, the way she'd watched her walk away a dozen times in the past months. But this time was different. This time she wasn't watching the set of someone's back. She was watching the end of something small and the beginning of something she didn't have a word for yet. She turned back to her table. Harold was standing there with Frank from Murfreesboro, who had apparently decided to make the drive a regular occurrence. "How many jalapeno you got left?" Harold asked. 2, she said. "Done," he said. 1 each. She sold the last 2 before 9 o'clock. Thanksgiving came with Cass and her husband Tom and their 2 kids, 11 and 8, who ran through the house with the concentrated energy of children who didn't visit often enough and were making up for it in a single 4-day window. Derek came back from Austin. He brought the woman he'd been seeing. Her name was Claire. She was a landscape architect. She had the comfortable quality of someone at ease in unfamiliar kitchens, and Margaret liked her immediately, which she kept to herself and showed only by asking her relevant questions and actually listening to the answers. They ate at the dining room table that hadn't seated 6 people in 3 years. Margaret had made a fig preserve to go alongside the turkey, a savory batch with thyme instead of rosemary, which Tom pronounced the best condiment he'd encountered, and which prompted a brief discussion about the word condiment that briefly threatened to become philosophical before Cass redirected it. After dinner, while the kids watched something in the living room and Derek and Claire and Tom were cleaning up with the particular efficiency of people performing virtue, Margaret and Cass sat at the kitchen table with the spreadsheets. They were real spreadsheets. Cass had built them over 3 weeks in her spare time. Columns for revenue, materials cost, time cost, estimated, Etsy fees, market fees, shipping costs, projected growth at 2 rates of scale. She'd printed them out and put them in a folder with a small paper clip on the corner, the kind of detail that told you everything about Cass. "Walk me through it," Margaret said. Cass did. It took 40 minutes. She explained the numbers without softening them. The current margin, which was decent but not exceptional, and the ways it could improve with scale, and the ways it could erode if scale wasn't managed carefully. She talked about the tipping point between cottage food operation and something that needed a commercial kitchen, and the costs involved in that transition, and the different models for how to approach it. Renting time in a shared commercial kitchen, which existed in 3 locations within 40 miles of Clover Falls, or something more permanent. "The something more permanent," Margaret said. "Tell me what that looks like." "It depends on how far you want to take this." "Tell me the full picture." Cass looked at her mother across the table. In the dining room, someone had put on music. Something low, something easy. The kitchen smelled like the remains of Thanksgiving, and underneath that, the faint, persistent sweetness of a week's worth of cooking. "Full picture," Cass said. She turned to a page in the folder. "At current Etsy trajectory, you'll hit the Tennessee cottage food revenue limit in about 4 months, maybe 3. At that point, you legally need a commercial kitchen license anyway. If you go to a shared kitchen, there's one in Clover Falls, the community culinary space on River Street. I looked it up. It's around $200 a month for 8 hours of access per week. That gives you 4 times your current cooking capacity, approximately. Is that enough? For the next growth phase, probably. For what I think you could build to in a year." Cass paused. "Maybe not. Then what?" "Then you think about a dedicated space, small commercial lease. You're not talking about a factory, a small unit in a commercial district, maybe 500 square feet. You'd need the kitchen build-out, which is the expensive part. Hood, commercial range, NSF certified surfaces, the whole inspection process." Cass turned another page. "I ran the numbers on a small business loan at current rates. At your current revenue growth rate, a $30,000 build-out loan would be serviceable. Tight, but serviceable. $30,000. Margaret sat with that number for a moment. It wasn't a number that scared her, exactly. It was a number that was large enough to be serious, large enough to require genuine commitment, large enough that there was no taking it lightly. "What's the risk?" she said. "The risk is the magazine coverage creates a spike that doesn't hold. You invest in capacity and demand falls back to something smaller and more stable." Cass said it plainly, the way you say things to people who can handle the truth. The counter risk is you don't build capacity, demand grows, and you can't meet it, and you lose customers to frustration before you've built the loyalty to keep them. Which risk is bigger? Cass thought about it honestly. In my assessment, the second one. Your growth pattern doesn't look like a spike. It looks like accumulation. Each piece of coverage, each word of mouth, it's building on itself, not spiking and dropping. The Instagram account hasn't plateaued. The Etsy reviews are already creating their own search momentum. She paused. "But I want to be clear that I could be wrong." "You usually aren't." "I'm sometimes wrong," Cass said firmly. "Usually about things I'm confident in." Margaret looked at the spreadsheet, at the numbers she'd been afraid to say out loud. "The shared kitchen," she said, "River Street. When can I see it?" "I called them last week," Cass said. "They have a tour available next Tuesday." Margaret looked at her daughter. "You called them last week." "I wanted to be prepared." Cass's expression was doing the complicated thing again. The accountant's control over whatever else was moving underneath it. "I'm an accountant. I prepare." "You also knew I'd say yes." "I knew you'd want the information." A pause. "And I knew you'd say yes." Margaret reached across the table and put her hand over Cass's hand, briefly, the way she'd done when Cass was small and troubled about something. Just a moment of contact. Just the fact of it. Tuesday, she said. The River Street culinary space was not glamorous. That was the first thing Margaret noticed, that it was functional and worn in the way of a place that had been used hard by people with real work to do. Commercial refrigerators with handle marks, a floor that was clean but scuffed, a hood system that rattled slightly at its edges, 6 burner stations along one wall, each with a heavy commercial range that looked like it could withstand considerably more abuse than Margaret's home stove. The woman who ran it was named Portia, 40s, efficient, with the comfortable directness of someone who didn't waste time on either selling or discouraging. She showed Margaret the space in 20 minutes without embellishment. 8 hours a week at the base rate, Portia said. You book in 4-hour blocks. We have a storage cage you can rent separately for finished product and supplies. You're responsible for cleanup to commercial standard after each session. We'll show you what that means. Health department inspection on the facility happens twice yearly. You're covered under our license as a renter as long as you're compliant on your own certifications. The cottage food upgrade, but the commercial handler certification. 12-hour course, offered monthly at the community college. Next one's in 3 weeks. Portia looked at her. You've done your research. I try to. Portia nodded, a single approving nod. The nod of someone who has shown a lot of people this space and can tell within 5 minutes which ones are serious. We have 2 slots open, Tuesday mornings and Thursday afternoons. Both, Margaret said. Portia looked at her. Both? Both slots. I'll take both. A beat. Then Portia said, I'll draw up the agreement. She told Roberta at Tuesday Cards, which was also attended by Jim, with his new knee and a woman named Dot, who was filling in for someone who was sick. She told it as a matter of fact, not as a triumph, because that was the way she'd learned to carry things that were too big to carry as triumphs. She told it the same way she'd told Roberta about the $3 peaches, the same way she'd told Cass she was trying to start something. Plainly, the way you tell the people who will tell you the truth back. Roberta set her cards down. Not dramatically, just set them down and looked at her. You signed a commercial kitchen lease, she said, a rental agreement. You are a businesswoman. I'm learning. Margaret. Roberta picked her cards back up, looked at them, set them down again. You started this less than 6 months ago, with $3. And my mother's recipe card. And your mother's recipe card, Roberta repeated. She looked at her cards for a long moment, and when she looked back up, her eyes were doing the thing they did sometimes, the thing she'd never call crying because she was Roberta and had her dignity. I'm very proud of you. I want you to hear me say that. I hear you, Margaret said. Good, because I'm only saying it once. Roberta picked up her cards and organized them with her usual deliberate efficiency. Now stop making me sentimental and play. Jim, who had said nothing during this, laid down his cards and a fan on the table. Rummy, he said, with the satisfaction of a man who had been waiting for that moment for 20 minutes. They all groaned except Dot, who laughed, and then they all laughed, and the game went on. January was the hardest month. Not because things went wrong, things went right. Significantly, consequentially, right, which turned out to have its own kind of hard attached to it. The commercial handler certification course was 2 Saturdays in December, 8 hours each, and Margaret passed it and felt no particular pride about passing it because it was simply something that needed doing, and she did it. She gave up her table at the Saturday market for 3 weeks while she transitioned to the River Street kitchen and rebuilt her stock, which cost her 41 regular customers she'd been counting on, and 3 very apologetic emails to people who'd been pre-ordering. The response to those emails surprised her. Out of 41, 38 wrote back. The vast majority said some version of take your time, we'll be here when you're back. 2 of them asked if they could order online in the meantime. One, Harold, of course it was Harold, wrote a message that was 3 paragraphs long and included a personal anecdote about his wife's reaction to the jalapeno on Christmas morning that made Margaret laugh in her kitchen alone. She went to River Street on Tuesday mornings and Thursday afternoons and she cooked. Alone, at first, in the large, slightly industrial space, with the rattling hood and the commercial range that had more BTS than anything she'd ever used, and responded to heat adjustments with an immediacy that she found both useful and slightly alarming. The scale was different. The quantities were different. The timing was different. She burned a batch of plum in week 2 because she misjudged the commercial range and stood in the kitchen looking at the scorched pot with the specific despair of someone who knows they should have been more careful. She scraped the pot, cleaned it to commercial standard, drove home, called Sal, and got back to work. That was the thing about the hard months. You didn't get through them by feeling good about them. You got through them by doing the next thing. By February, she had a rhythm. 463 jars in January, not counting the Saturday market, which she'd returned to in the 3rd week. 463 jars from a woman who had made 7 in her home kitchen in September and thought that was something. The Etsy store had 231 sales. She had reviews, real ones, from strangers, the kind you can't manufacture. This is the best jam I've ever eaten. Brought the bourbon peach to Thanksgiving, and my family demanded I order more. Finally, something that tastes like someone actually made it. She read each one carefully and then didn't let herself read them again because she'd noticed she could spend too much time in them, in the warmth of being seen, and warmth was not the same as work. She hired someone in February. It wasn't a dramatic decision. It was a practical one, arrived at by the same method she'd been using to arrive at every decision since September. List the pieces, look at the pieces, figure out which one moves first. She couldn't do 400 jars a month and pack and ship and manage the market and handle the email inquiries and run the social media account alone. Something would give, and she'd learned enough by now to recognize what needed protecting. The cooking. Everything else could be delegated. The cooking had to be hers. The person she hired was a 23-year-old named Tomas, who had been working at Hendrick's Produce, Sal's store, part-time, and had asked Sal if he knew anyone who needed help. Sal had called Margaret before Tomas had finished the sentence. He came for an interview on a Thursday morning, sat in her kitchen, and answered her questions with the quiet candor of someone who was used to being underestimated and had stopped performing otherwise. He didn't have food production experience. He had common sense, he was reliable, he could work mornings before his afternoon shift at Hendrick's, and he was, as Sal put it, the kind of person who finishes what he starts, which is rarer than people think. She hired him for 12 hours a week. Packing, shipping, market logistics, whatever she needed moved or organized or handled. He showed up on his first day exactly on time, which Margaret considered an extremely good sign, and she showed him the system she'd built for packing, and he learned it in 40 minutes and improved one part of it slightly. A different sequence for closing the box that reduced the chance of the jar shifting, which she adopted without comment because it was better. "You're going to work out fine," she told him, which was not something she said to people lightly. "Thank you," he said, with the seriousness of someone who understood that it wasn't a light thing. March brought something she hadn't planned for. An email addressed to Sycamore Preserves from a woman named Gail Sheehan, who introduced herself as a buyer for a specialty food retailer called Ardmore Fine Foods, which had 12 locations across Tennessee, Kentucky, and northern Georgia. She had seen the Tennessee Table article. She mentioned also tried 3 jars of the bourbon peach that a colleague had brought to their regional meeting. She was writing to ask if Margaret would be interested in a wholesale conversation. Margaret read the email twice. Then she went to the Ardmore website and looked at what they carried. The products, the presentation, the way they described the things they stocked. Small producers. Artisan food. Things with stories. Things with a reason behind them. Things that could tell you something about where they came from. She looked at her kitchen, at the shelf, at the masking tape labels with her handwriting. She wrote back. The wholesale conversation happened over 2 phone calls and 1 in-person meeting at a coffee shop in Nashville, which required Margaret to drive 90 minutes each way and left her with a coffee she didn't need, and the slightly surreal experience of sitting across from a professional buyer who wanted to put her jam in 12 stores. Gail Sheehan was direct and specific and had no patience for vagueness, which Margaret found relaxing rather than intimidating because she operated the same way. They talked about quantities, minimums, lead times, pricing structure, labeling requirements. They talked about the masking tape labels, which Gail said, carefully, would need to be upgraded for retail. "I know," Margaret said. "I've been thinking about that." "Have you worked with a designer?" "Not yet. I have someone I can recommend. She works with small food producers. She's not cheap, but she's good, and good is what you need." Margaret made a note on the legal pad she'd brought. The legal pad was the same one she'd been using since September. Well, she'd started a new one twice when it filled up, but she'd kept them all, stacked on the kitchen counter because they were a record of something. What's the minimum order per SKU? For our first order, this would be a test run. We'd be clear about that. 2 dozen per flavor, 6 flavors. We carry on a net 30 basis. I can do that. Gail looked at her across the table with the look of someone recalibrating slightly. You don't want to negotiate? The terms seem fair, Margaret said. I've done enough math to know my numbers. If the terms weren't fair, I'd say so. Gail smiled. I like working with people who know their numbers. I've had a good teacher, Margaret said, thinking of Cass with her printed spreadsheets and the paperclip on the corner. They shook hands before they left. The Saturday market in April was the 6-month mark, roughly, from the flat of damaged peaches on the floor of Hendrick's Produce. Margaret didn't think of it as an anniversary. She didn't have a precise date to anchor to, and that kind of marking felt too self-conscious. But she was aware of the time as she set up her table that morning. The table she'd bought to replace Jim's card table in February, a proper folding table with a clean surface and a tablecloth she'd ordered specifically rather than finding at the thrift store. The sign said Sycamore Preserves. It was the same handwritten sign she'd made in September, slightly worn at the edges, the letters faded just a little. She'd meant to make a new one. She kept not doing it. Tomas was there, helping set up. The birdhouse man, his name was Calvin, she knew his name now, waved from across the way. Mrs. Tran arrived at 7:42, which was 3 minutes earlier than usual, and bought 2 of everything without looking at the labels because she knew the flavors by heart. Harold came at 8 with Frank from Murfreesboro and also, this time, Frank's wife, who had heard about the jalapeno for so long that she'd decided to see it herself. She tried a sample, went still in the exact same way her husband had in October, and said to Frank, "You weren't exaggerating." "I never exaggerate," Frank said, which was clearly a lie they all understood as a joke. Roberta arrived at 8:15 with coffee, same as every week. She looked at the table, at the new flavors. Margaret had added a nectarine ginger in March, a fig honey in late February, and a small batch apricot with vanilla that she was still perfecting. And at the Ardmore Fine Foods order form that Margaret had printed and put in her bag because she was going to need to submit it by Monday. 12 stores, Roberta said. If the test run goes well, maybe more. It'll go well. You don't know that. I know your jam. Roberta handed her the coffee. That's enough. They stood behind the table as the market filled in around them, the April morning doing that particular thing April mornings do in Tennessee when the winter finally releases and the air comes back warm and carries something green in it. People moved through the stalls buying flowers and honey and the first tomatoes of the season, and they came to Margaret's table with the ease of people who knew what they were looking for. Diane's table was 30 feet away, same as always. She'd made a change in March, added a small handwritten element to her signs, which Margaret had noticed without comment. She'd also started doing samples, which she hadn't done before September. Margaret didn't know what to make of either thing, and decided she didn't need to make anything of it. People changed. Watching someone do something and reconsidering your approach because of it was just paying attention. It wasn't giving ground. Around 10, in a quiet pocket between customers, Margaret looked at her table and then at the parking lot beyond the market, and then at the town itself. What she could see of it, the library roof, the top of the water tower, the edge of the ridge beyond which the farms ran out toward the highway. She'd been born 60 miles from here. She'd spent 32 years building a life with a man who left cabinet doors open and planted a sycamore tree for the next 100 years. She'd buried him and been quiet for a while, and then one day she'd bought a flat of ugly peaches because something in her had refused, finally, the option of doing nothing. She hadn't been trying to prove something. That was the thing people sometimes assumed when they heard the story, that she'd been driven by determination, by the specific fire of someone who has something to prove. But that wasn't it. She'd just wanted to not waste the peaches. She just wanted to make something. She just wanted to use her hands and her mother's recipe and an afternoon at the stove and come out of it with something real on the other side. The rest of it, the market table, the emails, the magazine cover, the commercial kitchen, the 12 stores, the rest of it had followed from that. One thing after another, each step visible only from the step before it. You couldn't see it from the parking lot of Hendrick's Produce on a Thursday afternoon with $11 in your purse. You could only see it looking back. A woman she didn't recognize came up to the table. 40-ish, harried-looking, the particular Tuesday energy of someone who had come to the market on an errand and was running late for the next one. She picked up a jar of the nectarine ginger and read the label. "Are these homemade?" she asked. "Small batch," Margaret said. "I make them in a commercial kitchen on River Street." "Not from a factory?" "No, everything's made by hand." The woman turned the jar over, looked at the new label. The one the designer Gail had recommended had made, clean and simple, cream background with a dark green logo and Margaret's handwriting as the font, because they'd scanned her handwriting and turned it into an actual font, which had seemed improbable and turned out to look exactly right. The label said Sycamore Preserves, small batch, Clover Falls, Tennessee, and underneath the flavor name in small letters, made from what others overlooked. That last line was Margaret's addition to the designer's draft. She'd sent it in an email at 11:30 at night and not been sure about it until she saw it on the actual jar and knew it was exactly right. The woman read it again. "I'll take 2, she said. "Which flavor?" The woman looked at the table. She looked at it the way people looked at it now, with the slightly overwhelmed pleasure of too many good options. "What do you recommend?" Margaret thought about it, not performing the thought, actually thinking. "Depends what you're putting it on," she said. "If it's toast or biscuits in the morning, the peach bourbon. If you're cooking, the jalapeno. If you're doing a cheese board, the plum black pepper or the fig honey." The woman nodded slowly. "Morning person," she said, "and I have a dinner party next week." "Peach bourbon and jalapeno," Margaret said. The woman picked both up, paid with the square reader, tapping her card without hesitation, started to walk away, turned back. "What's the story? Behind the name? What others overlooked?" Margaret looked at the jar in the woman's hand, at the amber color of the preserves through the glass, catching the April morning light. "The fruit," she said. "Everything I make starts with fruit that was going to be thrown out. Bruised, soft, split. The grocery stores can't sell it. It just goes. But there's nothing wrong with it. It's good fruit. It's often sweeter than the perfect-looking ones because it's had more time on the tree. It just needs someone to bother." The woman looked at the jar. "And you bother." "That's the whole job," Margaret said. "You look at what everyone else passed over. You decide it's worth something, and you put the work in to show that it is." The woman was quiet for a moment, not in the way of someone done with the conversation, in the way of someone sitting with something. "I'm going to remember that," she said. She walked away into the market. Margaret watched her go, and then turned back to the table, to the next person waiting, to the morning doing what mornings did, moving forward, taking everything with it, not stopping to ask if you were ready. She'd learned something these past months, not a lesson she could have told you she was setting out to learn, not something she'd planned for or aimed at, but she'd learned it just the same, through the work and the failures and the burned batches and the cold mornings in parking lots and the emails she'd typed 3 times before sending and the math she'd done late at night when the house was quiet. The thing she'd learned was this: nothing she'd built in the last 6 months had started from strength. It had started from a small stubbornness about waste, about not throwing away what still had something in it, about looking at what everyone else had decided wasn't worth bothering with, and deciding quietly, without anyone's permission, that it was. She hadn't been fearless. She'd been afraid plenty, afraid of wanting too much, afraid of building something that came apart, afraid of standing behind a table in a parking lot with 12 jars and her dead husband's memory and her mother's recipe card, and being told, somehow, that it wasn't enough. But she'd done it anyway, not because she stopped being afraid, because she was 61 years old and she'd finally stopped waiting for the fear to leave before she got started. The morning moved, the market filled. Tomas arrived at 9 to help with the mid-morning rush, and she handed him the clipboard, and he took it with the competence of someone who knew exactly what was expected of him. Harold bought his jalapeno. Mrs. Tron came back at 11 for 2 more of the fig honey. Frank from Murfreesboro put 6 jars in a canvas bag he'd brought specifically. Donna from Ridgecrest arrived at 9:15 and was so pleased to find the jalapeno still in stock that she stood at the table and had a brief, genuine conversation about the first time she'd tried it and what she'd done with the second jar, which involved a recipe she'd adapted for pork tenderloin that she wrote down on the back of a receipt and gave to Margaret, and which Margaret folded carefully and put in her apron pocket. By noon, she'd sold 63 jars. She packed up the empty table at 12:30 with Tomas's help, the tablecloth folded, the sign carried under her arm, the clipboard with the names for next week's pre-orders tucked into the tote bag she'd been using since week 1. She walked to her car, the same 2009 Civic, the dent still in the passenger door, a small crack in the windshield she'd gotten in February that she kept meaning to get fixed, and she put the bag in the back seat and stood there for a moment in the April sunshine. She wasn't done. She had the Ardmore order to submit by Monday. She had a batch of apricot to refine. She had 61 Etsy orders in queue and a Tuesday kitchen session and a phone call with Cass on Thursday. And somewhere down the road, a decision about a dedicated space that she hadn't fully made yet, but was getting closer to. She wasn't done, and that was the whole point. Not the triumph of having arrived, but the specific aliveness of still being on the way. She got in the car, drove home past Hendricks, which she did out of habit now, checking the side of the building where Sal sometimes put out a sign when he had surplus fruit. There was no sign today. There was just the familiar storefront, the parking lot, the ordinary-looking place where none of this had been inevitable, and all of it had somehow started anyway. She turned on the radio, an old country station she'd been listening to since before her kids were born, and drove the rest of the way home in the April morning, the windows down, the air coming through warm and green and carrying something of the season in it. The sycamore tree was in the backyard when she got home. It always was. It didn't require anything from her, just stood there, being enormous and permanent and quietly indifferent to every good and hard thing that happened in the house beside it. Gerald had been right about it. It would be there long after all of them. She brought the bag inside, hung her apron on the hook by the door, and stood in the kitchen for a moment in the familiar way of someone home from work who hasn't quite shifted out of work yet. She looked at the shelf. There were still 19 jars on it, held back from the market, reserved for the Ardmore test order. They caught the noon light through the window, amber and warm, each one a sealed version of a Tuesday or Thursday at River Street, of Sal's discards transformed by time and heat and a stubbornness about waste into something that lasted. She put the kettle on, sat down at the kitchen table with the legal pad. A new one, the third one, the first two stacked on the counter. Wrote at the top of the first page, Apricot Batch 4. Try less vanilla, more lemon. And then, below it, because she felt like it and there was no one to tell her not to. Not bad for a Tuesday. She made her tea. Let the afternoon come.